is absolutely spectacular in the 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 vision of the greatness of God's creation. John, would you like to reflect for us?
Certainly. Thanks, Simon. Today I'm talking about order and chaos, and I'm focusing mostly on the familiar words of the first two verses of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was chaotic, a formless void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. These verses remind me of the engineer and the economist who are arguing as to which was the oldest profession. The engineer said, it's clearly engineering, because in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Surely a great act of engineering. The economist said, but who created the chaos? The story of the first chapter of Genesis is of God creating order out of chaos. God said, let there be light, and there was. God separated the land from the sea. God created life out of non-life, and many living things multiplied, whether they be plants or animals or humans. But although God brought much order to the world in God's creation, God did not actually abolish chaos. In fact, according to those two verses we heard, God created the chaos in the first place. In other religions, there is often a separate God of chaos or disorder who actually fights against the good God who creates the world and brings order to the world. But in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, there is only one God, and that God is responsible for creating everything, including the chaos and disorder in the world. In fact, God seems to like chaos and disorder so much that God embedded chaos into the very laws of the universe. That law we call the second law of thermodynamics. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but basically that law says that chaos and disorder will increase until the end of time. So life is a continual battle against the disorder created by the second law of thermodynamics. The ordered state that we see in living things is continually subject to forces that try and reduce that order. Everyone who has ever tried to keep the house tidy and clean knows about the second law of thermodynamics. No sooner do you succeed in getting the house tidy, but the kids come home from school and very quickly create mess and disorder. Or if you're building a sandcastle on the beach and the tide is coming in, you continually have to shore up your castle to defend it against the chaos of the waves. Life is about keeping chaos at bay by being ordered in our actions. We have to keep working to keep disorder at bay. As soon as we stop building up the sandcastle, our castle will get washed away. Of course, if we're a good engineer like Keith, we will build our castle of more durable materials than sand. So our castle will last a lot longer. But it is still subject to the forces of decay, and without maintenance and hard work, our castle will eventually fall. Why is it that God has made the universe with laws that mean that chaos and disorder is increasing? Is God being cruel to us by deliberately making things difficult? It turns out that the beautiful creation we have with so many diverse species would not have emerged without the disruptive force of the second law. If there was perfect order everywhere in creation, we would not have new species emerging. We would not see new ways of doing things emerging. It is only because species have to continually work to keep their castle from being washed away by the forces of chaos that we find new, better ways of doing things. The disruptive forces in creation push us to be builders and to be creative, rather than sitting around doing things as we have always done them. When we are in chaotic times, as we are at present, we can choose to whinge about how unfair it is, but such times are also an opportunity for us to be creative and do new things which are better than what we were doing before. So we can grasp the opportunities that disorder brings us with both hands. Then the second point I'll make in this reflection is that towards the end of Genesis 1, God blesses the humans God has created and gives them responsibilities in this new world. The commission that God gives to humankind is to be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Those of us concerned about the environment worry about this language of subduing the earth and having dominion over all living things. Many have used these verses to exploit the earth for greedy, selfish purposes. I am wondering if perhaps we can reinterpret these verses in the light of the fact that God has given us stewardship over a world which at times is chaotic and disordered. And that chaos does need to be subdued and controlled at times. And the meaning of the word dominion is to set rules. So dominion can be seen as bringing greater order to the world by the imposition of rules. Many farmers, for example, manage their land in such a way that the chaos of drought, flood and bushfire causes less damage to their land. That is, they bring greater order to the ecosystems they are managing. The wildness of nature is somewhat controlled, so their farm becomes more like a garden than wilderness. There's a place for wilderness as well, but wilderness can live alongside the more ordered gardens that farmers create. Aborigines were also masters at farming the land, using firing techniques so as to create more food for themselves. Their firing also created more order in the land. So we should not run away from the responsibility that God gives us of bringing more order to the chaos and disorder in creation. But our actions to control this disorder should come from love for creation, not greed. So, in Genesis, God commissioned us to be good stewards of the world. And then in the reading from Matthew we heard, Jesus also commissions us, in this case, to go and make disciples of all nations. Make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything that Jesus has commanded us. The language in this verse I find problematic. I don't like the idea of making people do anything. That sounds like we're dictating how people should lead their lives. But if we look at the way early Christianity actually spread, we see that the Gentiles became Christians not because they were forced, not because they were made to be disciples, not because they were persuaded with clever arguments, but because they were attracted to the love that Christians had for each other, and they wanted to be part of that love. The early Christians did not have organizations with lots of rules which said exactly what each Christian had to do. They were, in fact, a rather chaotic movement of people who cared for each other. They threw away the old detailed Jewish laws and followed the disruptive spirit. And out of this chaos, new ways of community developed. And many people did become disciples of the new way. So yes, Simon Clarke last week drafted a few words about the approach we could take with regard to the mission work we are planning for the inner north of Canberra. And I will finish by reading some of those words. The story of God's pilgrim people is that the status quo is not an option. God has always gone before us, exploring and discerning. God is doing a new thing. Will we follow? Our legacy, while important, has no bearing on our future. God needs us to be a church for our times and for the future. God calls us to true conversations around mutual purpose and authentic expressions of community. This is God's path for showing us who we can be. Our God is a God of diversity, unity, reconciliation, and relational. Our shared mission, the commission we have from God, from Christ, is an expression of the good news of the God who connects us into loving community. We are called to leave behind notions of the right way to be church and instead look to spirituality as connectivity. It is through this vision of our God and through vulnerable openness that we can discern the way forward. All this is in the knowledge that our God is a risk taker, and we need to be open to the vulnerability of risk. In the name of the God who is above us, God who is among us, and God who is within us. Thank you.
Amen.
So we're now open to the chaos of your argument discussion with regard to what I've said. So I look forward to that.
We're a small enough group, I think, for people just to make comments as they feel free. Thank you for that, John. I noticed, John Dyer, you sent out a comment.
Yes, a little bit related to the to John's theme today.
It sounds like a cop-out, John.
What was your comment, John? I didn't see it. Oh, I see. Oh, that yeah, it's a great excuse, isn't it? Yeah. But God gives us the responsibility to bring order to the chaos.
Cleanliness is next to godliness.
I really liked, John, your comments about dominion. As you so aptly stated, that's been used terribly across church history to justify things like slavery and raping and pillaging of our ecology, etc., and to see it as a loving process rather than a dominating process, I think is really a mindset that we have to ensure that we get to.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Joel.
Yeah, I went to the
You're breaking up terribly, Joel.
Black Lives Matter Indigenous deaths in custody.
Yeah. There's a bit too much chaos in that connection, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
John, isn't it Genesis 3 that states the whole thing differently? Isn't there versions of Genesis that one can sort of choose?
Yeah, no, and yes, indeed, and you know, and it's interesting in the first chapter of Genesis, for example, it doesn't name the humans as Adam and Eve. It just and doesn't say how many humans were created. It just says male and female they were created. So that's a different take in the first story. But there's all sorts of different versions for different reasons. So Genesis 1 only allows us to be vegetarians, and in fact only allows the beasts of the field to be vegetarians as well. And it's only after the flood that everyone's allowed to eat meat. So we have to not take these things literally, but understand the meaning behind them.
I'm just wondering, if I turn my video off, can you hear me any better?
Yes, indeed.
Is that better? Okay. You can hear me?
Yes.
All right. I went to the Black Lives Matter Indigenous Deaths in Custody rally in Garima Place on Friday morning. And although from one perspective it might have looked like chaos, I think it was an example of people trying to bring order out of chaos, out of a chaotic situation.
Thank you, Joel. Yeah, I agree. Are there any other comments for John?
Pam?
Yes,
Yeah.
Pam.
I was just thinking that the second version of the creation is the one that got Eve into all the trouble, you know, and women, because of that. I've just read about 3 books on medieval England, and of course that was used a great deal, just like the Dominion was.
Yes. Yeah.
So people literally and the evil person and sin and so on.
Very sadly, anything taken out of context tends to be used for power and domination often, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing.
I guess I always viewed the Old Testament as people gradually learning what God was like, and I feel that you know, a lot of it is what they thought at the time, but is not necessarily so. You know, as the song says, it ain't necessarily so. And I think you know, it was only fully revealed in Jesus and what God was like, and this was the Old Testament people's thoughts about it, a way they had of explaining things, which wasn't necessarily the absolute truth or the truth at all.
And sadly, we've been very slow to learn, haven't we, Robin? Margaret, sorry.
No.
Yeah. There was somebody else Was that you, Robin Bennett, wanting to make a comment?
Yeah, I'm sorry about my reception here today. I'm having trouble with Zoom. And I guess talking about the chaos, the fire and flood and violent storms and tornadoes is all part of the chaos of creating the world. And we wonder why we're getting that, but I think it's part of our creating the universe. It's still being created by these forces. I don't know. That's just my thought.
No,
Right, I think it's a process, not an event.
Terrible things happened in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's right, Audrey. Yep.
That's why I feel it doesn't apply today.
Unfortunately, it does.
Well, I think they're blaming it on God.
Oh, no, that's right.
I think that's the whole thing. They thought that God destroyed their enemies. And,
Are there any further comments? If not, I'll ask Robin to bring us our next reading, which is entitled God is Love. Thanks, Robin.